often that an inventor lives to see his or her invention turn 50, Willis Whitfield, who came up with the idea for the modern-day clean room in 1962, did, but just barely. Just before Whitfield died in November at the age of 92, a German author called to request an interview with him about the clean room's 50th anniversary. I took the call, but I didn't think much about it at the time until I started looking into what the invention's impact was. I was amazed that it all started here in Albuquerque. Whitfield's invention revolutionized electronics and medicine and enabled breakthroughs in nanotechnology, biotechnology, and healthcare. It made operating rooms safer and helped further space exploration. Whitfield was the son of cotton farmers in Eola, Texas, who learned to do it for themselves by fixing their own equipment. He served in the Navy late in World War II, so by the time he came to Sandia Labs to work in 1954 as a physicist, he saw himself as someone who needed to catch up with others his own age. In 1959, nuclear weapons components, mainly mechanical switching parts, were becoming smaller, and microscopic dust particles were preventing Sandia from achieving the quality the laboratories needed. A similar problem was happening in the private sector and the electronics industry. The practice at the time was to tightly seal clean rooms, wear protective clothing, and vacuum often. Still, the airflow is turbulent in existing clean rooms, and particles introduced were not removed. These measures didn't create the necessary conditions for manufacturing the tiny parts. Instead, Whitfield looked at the problem in a completely different way. His son told me after his initial research into the problem, he conceived the idea in about 5 minutes. He was so surprised that no one had thought of it before him that the first thing he did was to check the patent records to make sure that it already hadn't been tried. Whitfield's solution was to constantly flush out the room with highly filtered air. In his first model clean room, Whitfield designed a workbench along one wall. Clean air entered the room from a bank of filters on the wall above the bench that were 99.97% efficient in removing particles larger than 0.3 microns. For example, cigarette smoke blown in one side comes out the other as clean air. Clean rooms are a great place to work if you suffer from hay fever. The air is circulated in the room at a rate of about 4,000 cubic feet, or about 10 changes of air per minute. The linear speed of air is slightly more than 1 mile per hour, which is about the same as felt by someone walking through a still room. In a later modification, the air was passed down over the work from the ceiling instead of across, getting an assist from gravity in carrying the particles into the floor, which was covered in grating. Filters underneath clean the air, and it is circulated back around to re-enter the room. The constant flow of air performs a sweeping function. When Whitfield's first laminar flow clean room was tested, the researchers' equipment indicated 0 dust. Whitfield said, "We thought they were broken." When he first introduced the concept at a scientific conference, the results were so dramatic that his colleagues around the nation didn't believe them at first. Whitfield's clean room created a work environment that was more than 1,000 times cleaner than the clean rooms in use at the time. Whitfield gave his initial paper on what was then called the Ultra Clean Room at the Institute of Environmental Sciences meeting in Chicago in 1962. After that meeting and a Time magazine article that dubbed Whitfield Mr. Clean, his phone never stopped ringing. Within a couple years, $50 billion worth of clean rooms had been built worldwide. RCA and General Motors Company were early adopters of the clean room. It's thanks to the clean room that our cell phones and other electronics are so small yet can do so many things. Clean rooms also are saving lives. The Houston Hospital, today known as the N.D. Anderson Cancer Center, built 22 clean rooms to prevent infections in leukemia patients undergoing chemotherapy. Today they are used in hospitals to keep operating rooms cleaner and prevent infections. Whitfield eventually used the technology and worked with NASA to provide planetary quarantines during missions to the Moon and Mars and spacecraft sterilization techniques. Despite having invented something that changed our world, Whitfield remained a very modest man who just wanted to help others use the technology to make a positive impact on society. His son said that before he died, he felt satisfaction that he had done so.
The names of most deceased musicians will be forgotten in 50 years. Andy Williams, who cares really? But this year, a few people passed who changed the way we hear certain kinds of music forever. So even if their names fade from memory, their impact and influence live on. Dutch harpsichordist Gustav Leonhardt was a pioneer in resurrecting the instruments and performance techniques of pre-19th century European music. So for example, whenever you hear Bach played on a harpsichord instead of a piano, you're hearing Leonhardt's legacy. Jenny Rivera was a Mexican-American banda singer. She was the first woman to break into this previously uber macho genre, but she sold over 20 million records, and she was eulogized by Ms. Magazine as a feminist idol. Her struggles and successes inspired millions of Latinas to reach higher. Before Earl Scruggs and Doc Watson, bluegrass was considered novelty music made by hillbillies of limited ability. But their virtuosity and innovation transformed bluegrass music from a folkloric artifact into a style more like hot jazz, with blazing improvisation and technical brilliance. If you know the name of any Indian musician, it is probably Ravi Shankar. In addition to Indian classical music, Shankar studied Western composition and wrote many film soundtracks and orchestral works. He also taught Beatle George Harrison and composer Philip Glass, and influenced jazz giant John Coltrane, violinist Yehudi Menuhin, and flutist Jean-Pierre Rampal. He was arguably the first of the so-called world musicians, transcending national and cultural boundaries to create a global music. Likewise, if you know the name of any jazz pianist, there's a good chance it's Dave Brubeck. Like Shankar, Brubeck listened to music from around the world, and he incorporated the complex rhythms he heard into his unmistakable style of jazz. He was also one of the first white musicians to integrate his band in the 1940s against the prevailing norms of the day, and worked hard in the civil rights movement through the 60s. Brubeck's best-known work, written by his saxophonist Paul Desmond, is Take 5, which Alan Stringer will now play for us.
Speaker Ben Lujan ended his journey in this world with Carmen, his wife of 53 years, and his pride and joy, his children and grandchildren by his side. Even in his last few hours, the speaker was directing those around him, telling Carmen not to sign a Medicare form because it was the wrong one, and singing happy birthday to his older brother who was turning 93 that day. The speaker waited to finally let go of life until late on December 18, when his great-grandchild, a young man who had joined the armed service, could be with him. The speaker was raised in the Nambe Valley by his parents, Nestora and Celadon. Celadon was a sheep herder and one of the first laborers recruited for the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos. Ben attended Pewaukee High School and made a name for himself as a fierce basketball player, although he was not much taller than I am, and met his future wife, Carmen, who was a cheerleader. Ben wanted to be the first of his family to go to college, but the money was tight. He was forced to leave college and get a job as an iron worker in Los Alamos. The speaker spent the rest of his life in the Nambe Valley, nurturing the land where he was born and the tiniest acequia, raising sheep himself and raising his own children, including their miracle baby who came late in life, Congressman Ben Ray Lujan. Last January, on the opening day of the session, the speaker shocked everyone by announcing he had been suffering from stage 4 lung cancer since 2009. His doctors consider his living 3 more years a miracle, but those of us who knew the speaker understood his strong will, strong mind, and strong heart. The speaker's humble upbringing made him care so deeply about others, those less fortunate, those who relied on government to make their lives bearable. He was not about to give up before his work was done. 12 years ago, after Ben was elected speaker, he and I became solid allies to keep our Democratic majority in the House, which we've done every 2 years since, even through this past election and with his illness. It was painful to hear his weakened voice through the coughing, but even a few short months ago, he was directing me about how to win. He always amazed me because he knew every candidate in every race, and his suggestions and charges to me were often quite brilliant. The speaker struggled this summer with his illness. He lost his beautiful mane of white hair and had to wear baseball caps. I saw him at events in dark black caps and vowed to find him a better one, which I finally did, a cap of deep rust color, the color of his Abiquiu Hills, with the small emblem, "Life is good," on the front, and a message inside, "Do what you want and like what you do." That seemed to fit him perfectly. At the memorial service, Ben Ray told me his sisters had something to tell me. Jackie and Shirley hugged me and said, "Our dad loved that hat you gave him, and he wore it all the time." They mentioned the motto inside and how much he loved it. They told me the speaker was being buried in his rust-colored cap. 3 days after he died, I received a final letter in the mail from the speaker, which he had prepared the week before. I wish I could read the entire letter to you, filled with good wishes and gratitude, and as usual, a clear message. The speaker sums it up best, and I leave you with his own words. "Let us make our time on earth worthwhile and do what's right. Make a difference for the children, our working families, and our elderly. I want to encourage us to come together for them. We should never give up. We must persevere in our pursuit to do good, make a difference, and treat every man, woman, and child with respect and dignity." Vaya con Dios, Mr. Speaker.
Finally, this year, 20 children and 6 adults died at their school in Connecticut, gunned down by a man who, as is usual in these ever more deadly rampage stories, killed himself. And while there's nothing more inherently precious about these children than there is about any of the 5,740 children killed by guns in 2012, these children and their brave teachers may have finally changed the conversation about guns in our country and steeled our wills to do something more than cower in front of scared politicians or just hope that it never happens to us. And if that happens, if there is ever a Sandy Hook weapon control measure or a Sandy Hook mental health care provision, then the deaths of these children, while still unimaginably tragic, will not have been in vain. About them, and about all that we lost in 2012, I say in the words of the poet Adrienne Rich, who also died this year, "My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who age after age, perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world." We have a lot to do to be worthy of the poets, the teachers, the innovators, and politicians, not to mention our own beloved dead who live in our hearts. It's a bit overwhelming, but that's okay. Tomorrow's work, let's leave for tomorrow. For now, we say goodbye.